Oh, this was a very, very long time ago because I'm becoming an old man. This was, as a matter of fact, in Chile, in Latin America, in 1968. I was, instead of doing my military service in France, we had the possibility of serving in what was called cooperation in developing countries, and I was sent to Chile to teach statistics. And in this department of statistics of the University of Chile, they were interested by income distribution analysis. They had a very good database on coming from the social security system on wages. And they told me, if you want to work on these statistics, you are most welcome. This was 68. I was among the revolutionaries in the streets in Paris before moving to Chile. And then I worked on this set of data. And I was also completely taken up by the big debate in Chile in those days. This was 2 years before Allende's election. So the political debate was really very, very strong. And of course, it was around the issue of inequality. So I started there. I got interested in inequality. I got interested in development. And I kept working on those two issues all my life. We saw that, I mean, I worked on this with my colleague Christian Morisson, who was an historian, an economic historian. And we were quite impressed. We had a first paper which was on the global inequality. It was one of the first estimates of global inequality. This was done with another colleague, a Canadian colleague, Albert Berry. And it was back in the early 80s, we had some estimate of global inequality. And this was one of the first estimates of this type. And then we were quite surprised to see the level of global inequality, which was definitely much, much higher than whatever could be observed in a single country. And then we got the idea of trying to see whether this had always been the case. And in those days, the economic historian Angus Maddison, who died a few years ago, released a set of estimates for GDP per capita and population for most of the world since the 18th century. And so we decided to use that database to do some investigation in historical documents to see whether we would be able to say something about inequality within countries in this historical period. And then we got out with this very nice paper which was showing that inequality in the world had been increasing continuously from the beginning of the Industrial Revolution in the early 19th century until basically almost the end of the 20th century. We got first the idea simply because there was a lot of things going on on income distribution, on income inequality, and in those days this topic was not really a very it was not in the forefront. It was not a mainstream topic. An American economist, Henry Aaron, said, it was a long time ago, that studying income inequality was like watching the grass grow because nothing was happening. You had more or less unequal countries, but inequality was more or less constant, and there was nothing to be observed there. And a few of us were in complete opposition with this kind of statement. And a lot of work had been going on, and we thought with Tony Atkinson that it was important to put together what we knew in this area and try to advertise all the work which was done. And this was the reason why this first volume was published in 2000. In those days, we thought that we had said, or we had shown all what had to be shown on this topic. And then when the publisher came back a few years ago asking us whether we would like to have a second volume, initially we said, there is no point. I mean, we have said all what had to be said in the first volume. And then one day, having a dinner with Tony, we imagined, we said, okay, if we had to edit a new volume, what would be the chapters? And then we started thinking about all what was new, really, in this field. And we were amazed to see that there were many, many things new. And as a matter of fact, this was 3 years ago. It was not yet the case that inequality was really center stage as it is today. It was starting, but it was not yet the case. And there has been a huge progress made in terms of data. We were referring to history, a lot of work done on the evolution of inequality in the historical period, a lot of things being done at the frontier between ethical philosophy and economics about the way to measure inequality, why income inequality was a kind of restrictive concept of inequality, that we had to look at inequality of opportunities, inequality of capabilities, how could we go about measuring that. In macroeconomics, new views about the way in which the income distribution is moving at the same time as the economy is changing structure. All this was completely new, and we said, okay, fine, let's go on and let's have another one. And this is what will be published in a few months. I must say that the success of my colleague Thomas Piketty's book is quite amazing. I mean, I discussed with Piketty several times his book because he has the office next to mine in the Paris School of Economics, and I read and I discussed the French version when it was out. It was September last year. It was exactly a year ago, and we could not imagine that this would have such a success in the U.S. I think that there are two reasons for the success. One is the fact that definitely there is some concern in the U.S. about inequality. Inequality has been going up for quite some time. It reached a very high level, the same as what could be observed almost a century ago, or at the end of the 19th century. Some politicians are really concerned. Obama himself said, this is really a big issue and we'll have to tackle it. So there was, and certainly on the left in the US, people had been convinced for quite some time that there was a big issue there. So I would say this is part of the success. The other part of the success is that the book is provocative in the sense that it says not only that inequality has increased very much in the US, but it also said that inequality is bound to increase still more, and that most likely we will be back to a world which will be similar to the world which was described by Jane Austen, by Balzac, by these kind of people in the 19th century. And this is definitely a very provocative statement. Okay, this is the kind of society you are going to see, or that will be seen in 50 years or maybe a little more. And the final reason for the success, I think, is the publisher, which was Harvard. What's the name? Harvard. What's the name of the publisher? Harvard University Press. They did it very well. I mean, the title of the book in French was The Capital in the 21st Century. And the way in which this was presented in the cover in the US, in the American version, was that the was written in a very, very small print. Capital was the big word in red, and in smaller print in the 21st century. So basically, the book was proposed as a new capital, a new Karl Marx. And of course, this had to have a lot of success. Moreover, I must say that Piketty writes very well. The book is not only an incredible book in terms of the work which is behind it, I mean, the investigation, the exploration of all those historical data. It's absolutely amazing in terms of work. It is interesting in terms of the perspective that it gives of our societies. But on top, when he cites Balzac and all those people, this is very well done. And some of the chapters, you can read them almost as a novel. So this is the reason of this success. And because of that, now everybody is talking about inequality in the US or in the world. So even though some people may disagree with the basic thesis in the book, it is the case that the book has been extremely influential in pushing inequality to the forefront. I would say that the first question is, how was it possible to move from a world of very stable inequality at a rather low level or moderate level to a world where inequality is increasing and where nobody sees an end to that increase, maybe some stabilization at some stage, but we don't see any strong will to fight that level of inequality. And to some extent, we know that it would be extremely difficult to come back to the level that was observed, at least in the US, 20 or 30 years ago. To understand what happened is an incredible research topic, because it is certainly the case that technical progress is doing something there, definitely the case. But it is also the case that social norms have changed. Today, when you have those CEOs which are paid 100, 200, 500 times what the minimum wage in countries where you have minimum wage, this is something which was almost unthinkable 30 years ago. And today it is completely accepted. This may be linked to technical progress in the sense that it is certainly the case that movie stars and rock stars and sports stars are making a huge amount of money, basically because communication has completely changed, and through TV, through MP3, through and earlier through CDs, their art may be seen by many, many people in the world. In the case of the CEOs, not clear that you have something of this type. So there has been, and if you change the pay of the CEO, you have to change the pay of all the high executives in companies, and this is what is behind this disparities, this growing disparity in terms of earnings. To understand that, I think is really understanding the a very important component of the evolution of our world. And then the second part of this research agenda is it possible to do something against that? But even more than that, I mean, should we do something about this? You have in this area, some people say, we should not care about inequality. What matters is really to make sure that there are no poor people, and that there is nobody in a society with unsatisfied basic needs. And those people would say, so this society in which we are living is completely, or where we are going, is completely acceptable as long as we don't have people without homeless people in the streets, as long as we don't have poor people. Maybe this is where we are going. But it may also be the case that, no, it matters. It matters because too much inequality at some stage must create some kind of social disruption. At the time the Occupy movement started, many people thought that it was the beginning of a huge social movement. Same thing in Spain. Today we observe that nothing really, not very much happened. But presumably it is very difficult to imagine that inequality could keep increasing forever. At some stage, something will happen. When, how, we don't know. And because of that, something has to be done. And this is certainly a very important topic for researchers. But what I think is very, very important is the fact that this is not a kind of economic phenomenon which is pure economics. It is an economic phenomenon which is deeply entrenched into the evolution of the society. And this is the reason why it is such an incredibly interesting topic. It is the fact that we are not talking about deflation, we are not talking about high commodity prices, etc. We are talking about some fundamental evolution of our societies. And we can see in this conference of WIDER that there is a huge interest for all these issues. And this is something that we observe everywhere in the economic research community. And I think this will continue. I'm definitely willing to say something about this, especially because I have another book, a forthcoming book, which was already published in French, but the new and the expanded version, English version, will be published shortly, I mean at the beginning of next year, the title of which is The Globalization of Inequality, and which is partly touching upon this issue. When I was saying a little earlier that inequality in the world has been increasing since the beginning of the 19th century, when you look at the sources of that increase, it is essentially due to the fact that inequality between countries has exploded. You start from a world where, on average, people in Europe, maybe not in Britain, but in Italy, in Germany even, on average, don't have a standard of living much, much higher than in Turkey. And then 50 years later, there is a huge gap between those countries. This is a dominant factor until, what you just said, basically until the end of the 20th century, where 1980, the reforms in China, suddenly you have a 1 billion inhabitant country which starts increasing, or which starts growing at a very, very fast rate. And this is when you have the kind of reversal in the trend of global inequality, simply because China, India, then some other big countries, Indonesia in Asia, started to grow at a rate which was much, much faster than developed countries. And then in the 2000s, this was also the case for Africa, basically for the whole developing world. And so we could say that the turn of the millennium is really a trend reversal in global inequality from that point of view, and everything is coming from the between country inequality. And I'm more or less persuaded that this will continue, basically because growth in India, in China, in Latin America may have a lot of autonomy. These are big countries where the domestic market are big. There is more and more South-South trade, which is also reinforcing the autonomy of that part of the world. And I am persuaded that we have entered a period where the catching up of the north by the south is really going on and going on full speed. So this is really a very, very interesting period. Now, in all this, the fact that inequality has increased within China, has increased within India, has increased within Indonesia, those big countries, has increased in the US, certainly has contributed to lowering or to slowing down the decrease in global inequality, but their impact is much, much less important than the impact of the drop in the between-country inequality. I believe this is where there is some uncertainty. Many people consider today that sub-Saharan Africa finally has caught up with growth and that it is taking off. I will not say that there's been no growth in sub-Saharan Africa. Definitely since more or less the turn of the century too, they are growing at a very decent rate. We have to remember that this is also a region where the population is growing at a very, very fast rate, 2.5% or something like that. So when the whole region is growing at 5%, per capita terms, it would be only 2.5, which is not something which is fantastic. So they are growing, and from that point of view, this is a big difference in comparison with the 80s and most of the 90s, where they stagnated. But when we try to analyze the reasons why they are growing, there are two schools of thought. One school say they improve their policy, they improve their institutions, and now they are able to grow by themselves because they can rely on better institutions and better policies. This is probably right. There is something of this type. But I believe that there is another contributor to the African growth, which is the fact that for the last 10, 15 years, commodity prices have been extremely high. The terms of trade of African countries, I mean, the way in which they exchange their exports for imports has been improving, the terms of trade has been deteriorating almost continuously since the end of the 70s, the second oil price boom in 79. Since then, in Africa, the terms of trade have been declining until the mid-90s. And then they start stagnating and then increasing again. And to a large extent, I believe that African growth these days is due to these high commodity prices. The problem is, can we imagine that that they could rely on exporting raw materials to feed the growth of a population, which will be 2 billion people in 2050? This, I don't think it is possible. Because of the demographic reasons, Africa cannot grow or cannot develop as the Emirates in the Gulf. This is not the kind of growth that so the problem is that another engine of growth will be soon missing, And it would be important these days for those countries to build infrastructure, to build human capital, so that at some stage they will be able also to get into exporting services, exporting manufactured goods, exporting agro-industrial goods, and things like that. If they're not able to do that, then I don't know when, but in 10 years or 20 years, then growth will stall, and with a demographic growth, this will be a disaster in the whole region. So this is the reason why when I'm thinking about the developing world, I'm rather optimistic in Asia, in Latin America. I'm less optimistic. I mean, let's say that there is more uncertainty about what will happen in Africa. There are not so many institutions in the world which are specialized on economic research on developing countries with a size such that they can really make a difference. You have economics departments in many universities where a few people work on development issues, but you don't have many outfits where it is possible to concentrate on important global development issues, being able to have the best contributors by attracting people from academia to work on specific areas. I would say that the only other institution doing that is the World Bank. And then you have some institutions which are much more specialized, IFPRI, working on agricultural issues and things like that. But with this kind of general broad approach to development that is covering more or less all aspects of development, I believe that the World Bank and WIDER are the main centers. The World Bank is, to some extent, a bit constrained by being a bank, by being maybe close to the countries, close to the policymakers in the country, giving advice and very often giving money to the countries. So this means that the relationship between the research group and those countries as something which is not completely neutral because of that. WIDER doesn't have this kind of constraint, and because of that, I think that this is really very important. And I must say that I didn't attend this conference on inequality for a few years, and I'm back. I mean, I was invited a few years ago to give a keynote. This is the first time I'm coming back, and I'm very impressed by the level of the conference, and by the presence of WIDER in this debate. So certainly they are doing well, and I hope that they will be doing better, or that they will be able to increase or to scale up their activity in the future.